talking about the CRIF as something that exists out there, and then we are all in the Caribbean. We know it is there. It's paying immediately, providing cash, to the countries. A few years ago, that was the biggest innovation in the world, and there's a good thing in the challenges that the Caribbean face. The Caribbean faces the challenges as vulnerability, but this does push us to be more creative and to be more innovative. So, Minister Clark, we were saying that, I just mentioned that the Caribbean is at the forefront of, the innovative thinking in terms of disaster risk with the CRIF, with other ideas. Right now, everybody has acknowledged that Jamaica is the front runner in the Caribbean in the thinking, and not only thinking, but putting in place the elements of a comprehensive strategy and approach to managing these risks. So how do you see the role actually in Jamaica in the Caribbean on this agenda?
Well, first thing, we need to keep Jorge in Jamaica for a little longer. And the longer he stays, I like the sound of the things he's saying. Jamaica, repeat the last part, how is Jamaica?
How do you see the role of Jamaica?
In the region,
there is a lot
sure.
of things happening here. So how can Jamaica, Tassim was saying, what happens in Jamaica doesn't stay in Jamaica, but how can Jamaica help the rest of the Caribbean, in pushing that agenda as well?
So the risks that we identified earlier are common to the Caribbean. Jamaica has had its share of experiences, as many other countries in the Caribbean have. What we intend to do is, we believe that if we are, successfully put a policy such as the one I described in place, and follow it up by engaging the multilateral community in the procurement of products in that quadrant that can help transfer risk, and do so in a creative way with the international community, we believe that that will catalyze other countries in the Caribbean to think in a similar way. And the next round could be something that is multi-country. And when it becomes multi-country, costs go down for everyone, and the size could potentially increase. But we think that we need to get something done, lead, and others will come on board. Those conversations, certainly when I speak with my counterparts in other Caribbean countries, the path that Jamaica is on, others want to follow and want to replicate what we're doing. And if we can get this done, I have no doubt that we'll have others coming behind us, but more importantly, we'll probably be able to do something collaboratively. And who knows, it may not only be the English-speaking Caribbean. I see the Dominican Republic ambassador here. It could involve non-full member CARICOM countries such as the Dominican Republic. And that is why I believe that the multilateral community and the international community have a vested interest in Jamaica's success in this regard, because our success in this regard can be leveraged, and can be leveraged to bring others in, and not just in the Caribbean, but in the region, and not just in the region, but with other small island developing states.
Thank you very much. It's indeed, Minister Clark is pushing us, to push the frontier, to push the envelope, not only in the thinking, but I think that that's a challenge for all of us international development partners. If we help Jamaica succeed, then it would be a good example and a good mechanism to bring other countries on board. So, thank you for pushing us.
If I may just add, Jamaica has taken responsibility for the problems it found itself in. The problems we found ourselves in a few years ago are by no means unique.
Absolutely.
Suddenly, the world woke up this year, for the first half of this year, emerging market bonds took a battering because the world woke up and said, wait a minute, there's a lot of sovereign exposure because countries are heavily indebted, and emerging market bonds took a massive hit, and Jamaica was steady. We have taken responsibility, and we have had great success in doing so. If a country takes responsibility, bears sacrifice, sweats in peace, and then is still exposed, and everybody looks and says, well, you're on your own. What incentive will there be for other countries to do what Jamaica has done? So we say to you, multilaterals, and you in the international community, you have a vested interest in our success. Yeah.
Thank you so much. At this point, I would open up for questions from the audience. And we have 2 mics, I think standing mics. And I would like to ask you to move to the mics. And when you move to the mics, or no, they're not standing. So we have people who are moving the mics. So you just raise your hand. So when you get to the mic, please introduce yourself. Be very concise, and then indicate to whom your question is. It could be a short question, it could be a short comment. Short is important. And please keep to, you have such a distinguished panel, and I think that a lot of people might be tempted to ask questions that are keeping them at night, or that are not related to the topic. But please keep your questions and comments to the topic that we are discussing. And members of the media, if there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to individual panel members. So if you wish to do so, you should go and talk to Marcia Erskine, Christelle Chapois, who is our colleague, and Elaine from the Ministry of Finance. There she is, Elaine. There is a little corner here which will be available for short interviews, a few questions, so please indicate your interest to the 3 communications specialists that we have. Thank you. Yeah, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This afternoon's session, first of all, I want to congratulate the Minister of Finance and the World Bank.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know you, but...
I'm Eleanor Jones, Environmental Solutions Limited, an environment and disaster risk management specialist, having worked in the region, Yuri will tell you, for many, many years. This evening's presentation is an awesome presentation for me. It is something that we have been talking about for years and years, and so to see it happening is really wonderful. And I really want to congratulate you for beginning to look at the whole issue of financial loss with respect to the environmental risk and natural hazards that we face. We have suffered, not only in infrastructure. As we talk about damage and loss, we tend to pay attention to infrastructure. We have not really figured out how to deal with individual loss, personal loss, the whole business of poverty reduction each time we have an event that destroys assets at the individual, the personal level. So this is a wonderful start, and again, I just want to say thanks, and I want to endorse the point, all the points that have been made, but particularly the point that Yuri made with respect to environmental risk being integrated into investment planning. because I'm afraid that with all the talking that we're doing, we're still not doing that to a sufficiently high degree. And I think it's very important as we move forward, as we attempt to put this framework into place, we look at the underlying risk factors with whatever it is that we're doing, and we integrate that into the investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I guess that this is just a suggestion to keep in mind and no specific question, right? Yeah. Yeah, comment. Oh. So other?
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Robert Stevens, representing Jamaica Conservation Development Trust. One of the things that is very important in terms of resilience is the whole question of protecting our environment, and in particular our forests. Because when you have major hurricanes, etc., if you don't have proper forest cover, you know the situation. If you look at what happens in Haiti and in many other countries, the landslides and the various other things affect us. Now, that is affecting us somewhat in Jamaica. But I do believe that we need to set aside some funding for the support of the protection of the environment and the forests in particular. And part of the funding needs to look at, for instance, carbon trading and how we can begin to access funding for the protection of these areas. I think the World Bank has done a lot of work in that area, and certainly Jamaica could benefit from this, and we need to begin to plan for this.
Thank you very much. There's a question at this side, Carlene. No, over here to the left, gentleman.
This is one of 12 questions, so let me begin.
No, keep to one,
One.
please. Prioritize
My
one.
understanding is that Major Davis is the Chief Advisor to the Government on Disaster Mitigation Policy, correct? Major Davis, you are the Chief Advisor. That being said, my name is Christopher David Liu. I'm the current President of the Jamaican Institute of Architects. Minister Dr. Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. What figure in the current budget 2018-2019 has been allocated for disaster resilience on our existing stock of public buildings that will be turning into shelters in the event of a disaster, being an earthquake or a hurricane? Hospitals, schools, community centers, what percentage of our budget in a figure has been allocated for disaster resilience strengthening of these structures? Question one.
Thank you, Mr. Liu, for your question. And your question is exactly the purpose of this forum, right? That we're going to walk this policy through all the way to Parliament. I hope you're going to be there and supporting it. And the idea is that we begin to explicitly plan for the cost of natural disaster. Right, we have a general contingency in the budget, but that contingency deals with all kinds of contingencies. Where we need to go is that we have specific provisions that we use to purchase risk transfer products, as the case may be, or that we use towards fiscal savings via some natural disaster fund, and so on, as the case may be. You spoke about shelters, a very interesting and very appropriate example. On the resilience front, one of the things that we need to look at and need to be a part of our strategic approach is to what extent should we and can we afford, to have purpose-built shelters that would otherwise function as maybe schools or gymnasiums and so forth, that are at an appropriate level of resilience that can withstand a category X hurricane, whether X is 5 or 4. And so we know if something is coming, we can move people who are in vulnerable areas, in low-lying areas, mandatory evacuation, and they can go to one of several shelters across the island. These are things that we want to look at from a strategic perspective in the policy, and there's always, I will not use the word trade-off since Constance says there's no trade-off, but there are always alternative ways of spending money that you have to consider. And those alternative ways require a national conversation in which voices like yours will be quite important. And this evening is one of those conversations.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, good evening. My name is Shannon Stevenson. I'm a law student from University of Technology. So my question today is, what does fiscal responsibility as it relates to the microeconomical front look like? Because we have an economy that is heavily dependent on, for example, tourism, which affects our tradesmen, our hoteliers, our farmers, tradesmen, men and women, and skilled workers. They are like the most impacted and hence the most vulnerable when it comes down to the effects of natural disasters. Being that they're not established businesses and physical resilience might be an issue, but they may be able to deal with that. But when it comes to financial preparedness, that is a big issue, because we have seen where just to start the business is a huge hurdle to cross. So how can we, with all these amazing policies as being mentioned, what does that look like? What can someone in this vulnerable space do to protect their livelihoods? Thank you.
Yes, Jorge wants to take. The mic.
I hear three questions that are related, and they are also related to my dilemma with respect to the geometric representation of resilience, right? Because if we had gone the 360 way, I would have added a couple of elements. And one of the elements is precisely the social dimension, no? where your question fits squarely. So let me tell you how it's dealt with exposed. No? So St. Martin, hit by a Category 5 hurricane last year, is exactly in the situation that you described. Lots of people lost their livelihoods. Many, they still have their jobs, but they are not really working because the hotels they used to work for have closed for a year. So how do you deal with that? Through an adaptive safety net. So through a conditional cash transfer, people are getting resources from a conditional cash transfer, and they are participating in training that will improve their human capital and will generate a benefit for the economy. So that would be an example of how you deal with the social dimension of this. Now, in the case of St. Martin, it's exposed, but it could have been ex ante. You could design a social protection system beforehand so that it kicks in the case of a disaster. And then the other question that is related is the one on protection of natural resources, which is another dimension of resilience, which is very, very important. The gentleman that brought it to the room mentioned forests, but the same would apply to mangroves, for example. No? So those are clearly, so maybe we should stick with the circle and not the pillars, but one never knows.
Yes, Major Clive Davis.
I would just like to add that one of the fundamental issues that will have to be addressed in small island developing states like ours, and those that are heavily dependent, for example, on tourism, is the diversification of the economy. If we don't go there, we are going to die. When sugarcane was king, we were king. Sugarcane left us. Then banana became king. Banana left us. And I'm saying that unless we wake up to the reality of it's cassava now? I hear you. I hear you. But the diversification of our economy is going to be our lifeline. Thank you.
Yeah. We have another panelist who wants to answer this question. Your
Yeah.
question was a very well formulated, actually like 3 or 4 questions. Very skillful.
I think it was an exceptionally good question, and the important thing is that we, in conversations like these, sometimes we forget the social dimension. Yeah, two good examples that come to mind is with conditional cash transfer is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a very complicated system of drought early warning system, and they have identified the vulnerable households in communities that may bounce in and out of the safety net program. So when there is a drought early warning alert, that the country looks at the hotspots of vulnerable households and begins to ramp up the social safety net programming. And the international community joins by supplementing the Ethiopian social safety net programming with that type of example. But I just wanted to underscore again and reinforce the social dimension. I mean, I've just come back from a visit to New Orleans. The IDB organizes these cutting edge learning sessions, and we were able to go to meet with city officials and local NGOs, etc. And the strong thing that came out of that whole experience was that 13 years on, post-Katrina, in most developed country, one of the most developed countries in the world with all the resources, they are still struggling with recovery. And so recovery is something that I think that in that tension between resilience and risk transfer, that there has to be a strong focus on social recovery, and how do you engineer that or facilitate that in your policy?
Thank you. And just to add, you know that Jamaica has a well-functioning conditional cash transfer system, and I know that there is thinking in the government of how to tweak, you know, this conditional cash transfer so that it could be more responsive and adaptable in cases of, you know, when disaster hits. So the good thing is that there is a good basis, and you can really adapt that system to provide assistance in case of disasters. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Sure.
High Commissioner? Yeah.
Yes, Laurie Peters, Canada's High Commissioner. I have a comment and a question. As a long-standing partner of Jamaica and one of the international community members who leans in significantly in this space, I can't tell you how heartening it is and how important it is to hear Jamaica's ownership on this. And the importance of knowing that you have a plan and a policy to which we can lean into, because we're all wanting to make sure that what we're doing is meaningful and appropriate and significant, but we can't do that without your ownership and without your plans and policies. So thank you, indeed, very heartening. In terms of innovation and creativity, I wonder, and directed anywhere along the panel, I wonder what the thinking is around the private sector, and how the private sector can be a player in this space. And we can look at this with a PPP approach as well to extend the international community contributions, but also Jamaica's investment in this area. Thanks.
Thank you. Minister Quirk?
I'll probably go first. That's an excellent question, High Commissioner. And we can look at it from many ways. One of the ways in which I look at it is the penetration of insurance in Jamaica is extremely low. In the private sector, I know a little bit about insurance. We had an insurance company in the group. And the percentage of Jamaican households, if you just look at household insurance, the percentage of Jamaican households that are insured is probably about 20%. And by insured, I mean fully insured. And that is a problem. That's a public problem. That problem is not only a problem for the individual, but it's a problem for the state. Because when severe damages occur, ultimately it gets transferred. And if you think about the fact that we have a number of people who live in irregular settlements and irregular communities, there was a study done in 2010 which estimates it at 1 in 5, or in terms of Jamaicans, a significant number. The vast majority of people who live in irregular settlements are uninsured. And persons who live along gully banks and so forth. So one of the things that the private sector, I've heard a couple of companies speak about, is seeing that as a huge market opportunity and trying to innovate with micro insurance to take some of that, using up, the profit motive being the catalyst there. And the government will have has an interest in seeing that happen. With respect to other, I guess another way of looking at it is to what extent capital markets here would be interested in looking at the risk from another perspective. Capital markets getting involved in risk mitigation. I don't know if our markets are deep enough as far as that is concerned. We could also seek to get more participation from international sort of insurance firms to be operating locally. So if we talk about the private sector, local and international. Those are just some of my thoughts as an immediate reaction.
Thank you. And
so if we go through all the different elements of building resilience, I think that the private sector has a role to play in each and every one of them. No? First of all, building resilience is an issue that should involve society as a whole. It's not just a government issue. It's an issue that affects individuals and certainly the private sector. So on better preparedness, the private sector needs to prepare as well. And there are issues that go from making sure that the infrastructure, which is managed and owned by the private sector, should be resilient on its own right, to having the appropriate procedures to deal with disaster. On the social front, helping people with their livelihoods, these conditional cash transfer programs that I was describing, they were done in St. Martin, are being done in partnership with the private sector, because the private sector also wants to make sure that whatever training comes together with the program is going to be useful to generate human capital that will create more value for the economy as a whole. On the financial side of things, on the risk management side of things, I think that the private sector has a role to play in the design of new instruments, and then these are market-based solutions. So we will need the involvement of reinsurance companies, we will need the involvement of funds, intermediaries, to make this work and to keep the momentum in terms of the evolution and innovation in the financial instrument front. So I do think that there's and of course public-private partnerships. In a time when there are fiscal constraints, there is a need to strengthen infrastructure. I'm not advocating for anything, but if you have a publicly owned airport, maybe a way to increase the speed of strengthening the airport is by going into a PPP and making the resilient aspect of it part of the deal with the company that's going to manage the piece of infrastructure.
thank you. Just one major point, David.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to say that whereas because of where I sit, my focus from time to time might be on the recovery of the organizations of the state. True, that might be the case, but I'm convinced that we cannot have a recovery from any shock without the private sector recovering. It is the recovery of the private sector that is going to cause the rest of us to recover. There's no recovery for Jamaica after a shock without the intimate and full involvement of the private sector. And so there is a policy of embracing the private sector. It is something that I don't think we do enough of, but we have to, because your contribution is critical to our recovery.
Galina, if I
Thank
may,
you.
just 30 seconds. The way I would think about this is in terms of complementarity, because when you think about risk, you have macro risk, aggregate risk, that the government is in charge of, and I think the government of Jamaica have been doing a fair deal of that, and you have the personal idiosyncratic risk. So I'm hopeful that as the government continue to insure Jamaican against aggregate risk, they will be more driven to actually insure against idiosyncratic risk.
Thank you. My timekeeper is telling me that I have to close, but I don't think that it's fair to close before giving a warning that this is going to be the last question. So, one last question.